Greetings. My name is Letitia Hensley, and I'm the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools Director of Family and Community Engagement. We are excited that you are joining us today and know you will gain great insight from this session. At the conclusion of today's session, please provide feedback so that we can continue to support you with amazing sessions that will be provided throughout the year. Now, without further ado, we'll turn it over to our presenters.
Welcome to Section 504 with the Family Academy. My name is Benjamin Bender. I have the privilege of serving as the Section 504 Program Manager for CMS Schools. Just to give you guys a little bit, a little bit of background on myself. I used to be a special education teacher, a school counselor, and a school psychologist. I have transferred into working at the district level to support the Section 504 program within CMS. So, we do have the translation support here. The directions are right here at the top right corner. You would click captions, click the show live captions, and then select the language from the drop down from what you need. Also, guys, we have the unique capabilities of a Q&A. There at the top, you can click on the Q&A. You would type in your questions in the box. We'll be monitoring your questions, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Feel free to share your reactions during the presentation so we know how we're doing. And of course, guys, we really want to hear from you. We do feel like feedback is the key. We are going to put the bit.ly in the Q&A for you guys to give us some feedback on how this session went. So with this, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. Probably as parents and educators, we hear a lot of like numbers and letters. We hear 504s and IEPs and MTSS and IHPs and EAPs, and I know it can get really confusing. And today, what we're going to try to do is clear up what is Section 504. We'll talk a little bit about differences with what IEPs are, and we have these things called healthcare plans, and there's MTSS and all this kind of stuff. And we're really going to kind of focus on for the next hour, 45 minutes or so, on what Section 504 is and how it can help support the children in our district. So again, I want to kind of introduce you to our team. We have a wonderful team here in CMS. Again, my name is Ben Bender. I'm the program manager. We have an awesome program assistant, Linda Powell. And then in addition to myself, we have 5 what we call 504 specialists. And each specialist is supporting 30 to 40 schools. And you may see them in 504 meetings there. They're there to support the families and the schools with Section 504. So moving through, and here's our amazing team, Lamia, Amy, Shelley, Rachel, and Nisha. So what we're going to first go through is just higher level federal laws and guidance. It can get a little confusing. You can find it on the websites, and I really what I want to do is try to break it down so it makes sense. We know a lot of this stuff can be very confusing, and we want to kind of break it down so that you guys as parents are advocates for your kids, and that so you can understand how you can support your families. So here's what Section 504 is. It's part of a Rehabilitation Act of '73. And here's what I think of as the core foundation of what 504 is. It simply says that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federally financial assistance. So that's like the law of Section 504. And really what it comes down to is because schools receive federal financial assistance or funding, we have to provide this law of anti-discrimination so that our students, our children who have disabilities cannot be excluded, denied, or discriminated against based on their disability. Again, like we said, it's a civil rights law. It prohibits discrimination. Now, it is enforced by the federal government, specifically the Office for Civil Rights. A little bit of background history is It really was widely expanded in 2008. Not to bore you with too much history, but what's the important thing about that in 2008 is it expanded eligibility. Before it was very selective, and now after 2008, it's really expanded its eligibility and support of our students. It ensures that the student with disability has equal access to FAPE, and we call that free and appropriate education. That's what they get in the schools. What it allows is to accommodate a student with a disability as adequately as their non-disabled peers. But here's the key, and this is the balance that we have to do at these 504 meetings, is we can accommodate and do our best to provide equal access. But we can't provide a leg up or what we call an undue advantage because then what we're doing is we're actually discriminating against our non-disabled peers. So, a very common accommodation out there is extended time. Okay. And we hear, well, he'll do better with extended time or she'll do better with extended time. And that may be very true. I get that. But what teams have to look at is, does the student's disability require them to utilize extra time because of their disability? Because if you're just giving a student extra time, then you're giving them an advantage. And then that child that doesn't have that disability is put at a disadvantage. So it's a very tight rope, and we'll talk more about that of what's an appropriate accommodation. So this is one of my favorite sayings. It comes from a quite famous, what we would call Section 504 lawyer down in Texas. And he would say, Section 504 provides the individual the opportunity to create their desired outcome without discrimination. Okay. And I really like to say because we got to provide them the opportunity to be successful, what they want to get out of schooling. Okay. It doesn't guarantee them certain grades or a way to take a test. We are giving them the opportunity to have equal access because of their disability. And again, those are the things that teams have to really look at the data to determine what's appropriate for a student. So, how do you become eligible under Section 504? What a team has to determine first is a student eligible under 504? And what you have to say is, does the student have a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? That's the key. That is what eligibility is about. And what we're going to do over the next 30 minutes is take that statement and break it down. We're going to talk about what is a physical or mental impairment. We're going to talk about what it's meant by substantially limit. And then we're going to talk about what does it mean by a major life activity. By breaking down those three things, we can really get a better understanding of how a student would be eligible under Section 504. Now, keep in mind, to be eligible, there's only one major life activity that has to be substantially limiting. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, like we've already talked about, 2008 really expanded and clarified what constitutes a major life activity. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how does Section 504 and FAPE intertwine each other's? And what we've said, and we've kind of alluded to that, is students with disabilities, they have the same rights to that free and appropriate education as compared to their non-disabled peers. FAPE, or free appropriate education, it should be provided to all students, regardless of the severity of their disability. And again, Section 504 and Title II require that all public schools provide that appropriate education and modifications, aids, or even related services free of charge to the students with disabilities. That's what FAPE is that it has to be free of charge to the parents. So if they need aids, if they need related services such as therapy, physical therapy, audiology support, it has to be provided free to the student if it's required. Now, like I alluded to, there's a lot of numbers and letters out there that can be pretty confusing to parents and even educators. I've been in meetings where teachers are looking at me like, well, what I don't know what you just said. So what we try to do here is break down three major programs that support students with disabilities and how they're the same and how they can be different. Section 5.4, like we talked about, civil rights law prohibits discrimination based on the disability. Eligibility is determined by a team based on medical information, or it can be school-related information. And we'll talk more about that. Here's what's key. You can be eligible, but not need a plan. And we'll get more into that later on. And again, these protections are under the safeguards of Section 504 law. Now, compared to 504, a more supportive program out there is something called an IEP or an individual education plan. Now, those are based on what the law called IDEIA, or you maybe have heard of IDEA. And in that program, you have to qualify for one of 14 categories. And here's the key. The biggest difference I can say between 504 and an IEP is a child with an IEP requires what we call specially designed instruction. It is instruction that is required to serve a child in special education. Okay, they may receive modifications to the curriculum and accommodations as part of the IEP. And again, those protections are under IDEIA. Now, in addition to IEPs and 5.4s, we have these things called individual healthcare plans. They may be called IHPs or EAPs, which are emergency action plans. And what those are, they're plans developed typically by a nurse or medical provider on how we can support the student's health in the building. You may have, children out there that get medication that's provided at the school building. You may have a child that has diabetes that has a diabetic care plan or an asthma action plan. These are all what we would call healthcare plans. Now, here's the difference: is students don't have the due process or procedural safeguard protections that come with the 504 or IEP programs. And that's why it's important that if a student, I get the question, well, Ben, if they have an IHP or an individual healthcare plan, why do they need a 504 plan to go along with it? Well, that's because those legal protections are not there with an IHP or an individual healthcare plan. We also get this, hey, Ben, can I have an IEP or a 504? Can I have them together? Because, we need to support this kid as much as we can. And here's this. There are some districts I have heard of out there that do a 504 and an IEP at the same time. And every legal guidance we have heard, and you can look it up on the OCR website, is they will say that anything that you put on a 504, you can put on an IEP. So there's really not any need to have both, because a kid with specially designed instruction needs, an IEP, can also receive the same supports under 504. And really, logistically, it makes so much more sense to have that one plan under an IEP. What happens if you have a conflicting 504 and IEP plan? What are you supposed to follow? So really, you need to have one or the other with a 504 plan. But when it comes to an IHP, an individual healthcare plan, you can absolutely have an individual healthcare plan with an IEP, and you can absolutely have an individual healthcare plan with a 504. So that kind of breaks down the different type of programs we have here. Now, when you're looking at what is a 504 team, and many of you may have been part of 504 teams or IEP teams, 504, they're a little vague, I would like to say, in how they determine membership. Legally, they say it has to include a person who knows the student well, which may include the parent, counselor, teacher, a coach. Then it also must include a person who can interpret data. That could be the school testing coordinator, an administrator, a school psychologist, a school counselor, or the nurse who understands that diagnosis. And then it's a person who can make placement decisions. You maybe have heard, like in the IEP world, something called an LEA. Well, this is kind of like the closest we have to an LEA or our local educational agency. That's typically reserved to administrator or district staff. Some other members, excuse me, of team members you may see is social workers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, audiologists, maybe even school-based mental health therapists, interpreters, ML, EL facilitators. Those can all be part of that 504 team. Now, we will say, parents are obligated. If they feel the need to bring legal representation, that is well within the right. But just make sure that we understand that if a parent does bring legal representation, then our district needs time to provide our own representation at these meetings. So 504 always starts with what we call an evaluation. When you're at a 504 meeting, there's really two major decisions that you're making as a team. Does the student qualify under 504? Remember that saying, like, does the student have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity? That's the evaluation. That is eligibility. And to make that decision, you're looking at all these variety of sources you see on the screen. Parent input, teacher input. Are there any special education records, discipline records, MTSS data, which is like interventions, mitigate measures. We'll talk more about that, such as like medication. You're looking at grades, student health information, medical evaluations. Is there a diagnosis from a private physician or medical provider? State test results or attendance. Like all this information is used to determine eligibility. So when you are discussing eligibility, you're asking these three main questions. Does the student have a physical and mental impairment? Okay. And we'll talk more about that. ADHD, asthma, diabetes. Then you ask, does it affect a major life activity? And we'll talk more about that here in a couple slides, but is that learning? Is it walking? Is it communicating? And then, does the physical or mental impairment, what we call substantially limit a major life activity? If the team determines yes to all these questions, then the student is eligible under Section 504 and they receive those protections against discrimination. Now, people are asking, well, what's an example of physical or mental impairment? And it is exhausting. Like it is so many. We have neurological, organs, respiratory, speech, physiological disorders, mental retardations, brain syndromes. Like all these things may be included under a physical or mental impairment. There's so many out there. So once you determine what is the physical or mental impairment, you have to say, okay, if my child has diabetes, what major life activity or major bodily function does it impact? I mean, for me, if you're looking at a child with diabetes, it probably impacts their eating. They have to eat certain foods. You got to keep those carbs under control. Um, you have to look at, like, if you're looking at ADHD, maybe you're looking at concentration. So you have to look at the condition and as the team say, okay, what does it impact? Now, the government does us a favor and they don't tell us what substantially limits means. All they say is it's up to the team to determine what is substantially limited. Like they say, there's not a single formula or scale that measures substantial limitation. But it also says it doesn't require extensive analysis. So what I tell teams is this child who has diabetes and this child who doesn't have diabetes, is there an impact significantly or substantially to their eating, to a bodily system? If you're talking about ADHD, do you see an impact compared to a non-disabled peer with their concentration or their activity level? And it's up to the team to decide if there's an impact. Now, this third bullet I really have to point out, because this is a part that I think some teams miss, and we need to make sure that we hit it, is that we must consider the student in the raw state. And people are like, well, what's that mean, raw state? Well, when you consider eligibility under Section 504, you have to strip away the positive impacts of mitigating measures. So I keep going back to the same examples of diabetes, okay? A mitigating measure is anything that helps that condition. Okay, so think of the medications and the insulin that child needs. Take that away, and do you see an impact? And to me, absolutely. Because what happens to that child if they don't have their insulin? You will absolutely see an impact. If you have a child with ADHD and a mitigating measure is medication or counseling or tutoring, what is that child like if you take away all those things? And if you see an impact, then that kid is substantially limiting and is eligible under Section 504. Like we've talked about, mitigating measures is taking into account all those positive effects of raw in that you want to look at it in the raw state. So examples like we talked about, medication, counseling, therapy, healthcare plans, tutoring. Now there is an exception, and that's corrective eyeglasses. That is one thing that the law says that you don't really have to count eyeglasses as a mitigating measure. So we've already decided the student is eligible. The next main component we have to look at as a team is, does the student need a student services plan, or we call a Section 504 plan? Now, that decision is made with the effects of mitigating measures. So we have many, many kids, thousands of kids in our district that are eligible under Section 504. They have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. But because of the help with mitigating measures, because they don't see an impact in the school environment, there's no need for an accommodation. And I know some people ask, well, then what's the point? And the best way I can respond to it is, one, it is protection against discrimination. It is the law, and that way you are protected under Section 504. The other thing that it really does is it has the school look at the student every year to see how that child is doing in the school environment. Because just because the kid doesn't need a plan in sixth grade, hey, they're stepping up to seventh grade, they're going to middle school, those mitigating measures may not be as successful anymore. And so then the student may need some type of accommodations to get that equal access in the school environment. So what I love doing this, and I do this with all our case managers here in the district, is we talk about, well, how do you make a decision on whether an accommodation is an appropriate for a student? And what you want to first do is look at the diagnosis, the impairment, okay? Example, ADHD, anxiety, asthma, okay? What is the diagnosis you are looking at? Then you have to look at, okay, what major life activity is substantially limiting? So if we're talking about ADHD and it impacts concentration, even with mitigating measures, what type of accommodations does that child need, that student need, to address the concentration concerns? In many cases, maybe they need teacher redirection. Maybe they need preferential seating. They need to be seated close to that teacher to help them pay attention. Maybe they need some information chunked for them. All right. If you're looking at something like diabetes, that impacts that endocrine system. You know, maybe that child needs access to the bathroom, or they need access to snacks throughout the school day. So for each condition, you look at what the impairment is, how it substantially limits, and then based on what is substantially limiting, what do you see a deficit in? Where do you see the concerns? That drives what accommodation is needed for the student. So again, here's some examples: ADHD, concentration, reminders. Irritable bowel syndrome, it affects digestive function, and maybe they need more frequent restroom breaks. For a child with anxiety, maybe they have trouble interacting with others, and maybe they need access to a trusted adult or some type of brain break to allow them time to um, compose themselves. So you can see that each one is a little different based on what is substantially limiting for that child. I show this to all my case managers, and I think all parents should know this as well. Plans must be followed as written. Their implementation is not a choice, and it's required by law. All right. At the same time, we provide it to only the teachers that need to know about this. I am very stern about respecting student confidentiality. That is your child's plan. That is your child's diagnosis. And only the people that have the need to know, of vested interest in that child, should have access to those records. So we are very clear that we have to respect student confidentiality, and we're not supposed to disclose in front of other kids or staff members that that child has a 504 plan. Okay. We do offer evaluations for students that live within our district that attend private schools. Okay, so we do leave some contact information here. This is our help desk. If your child does attend a private school and would like to be evaluated under Section 504, you would contact us and we would go through the process to see if that is appropriate. One thing that I'd love to clear up here, guys, is Section 504 doesn't require a medical diagnosis. And you'll read about that, we can't say, well, hey, mom, dad, once you go to the pediatrician and get a diagnosis, then we can come back and have a 504 evaluation. And that's not totally true. We want to make sure that if this is part of Child Find, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, is that if we suspect an impairment, then we as a district have the duty to evaluate through that. And so sometimes we will utilize our school psychologists to evaluate for what we call educational determinations. It's not a diagnosis. Diagnoses come from medical providers like doctors and psychologists. But our school psychologists can help make a 504 team make what we call an educational determination in areas suspected impairments such as ADHD, anxiety, and depression. Now, a lot of times we get this question, well, what if my kid hey, it's the day before EOGs or EOCs, and they're out in the backyard and they're playing on the trampoline or whatnot, and they jump off and they break both their legs, right? Like, is that an impairment? Yeah, they can't walk. Is that substantially limiting? Yeah, they probably can't. But does that fall under Section 504? And typically they don't in that kind of case. They still need to be provided access. Let's say your child rides the bus and they break both their legs from an activity and they still need transportation. This falls under what we call transitory impairments. And this is for impairments that last less than 6 months and usually can be resolved. Now it's case by case. And if you're going to get my contact information, we really try to get this information out to the schools as much as possible. Again, we got almost 150,000 students, so we do our best to get it out there. Let us know if you're having some concerns. Hey, my child broke his arm and now he can't take the end of grade test. Like, transitory impairments can receive accommodations so they can access the learning environment. I am very blessed. I have a senior now, and I am just learning like everybody else, having a high schooler right now. And so I am learning all kinds of new things. I feel like sometimes I learn more as a parent than I do as an educator. And we want to make sure that students are covered once they go into college. I am so pleased. My son's already been accepted to a college. We're so thrilled for him. And I think about as a parent, like, how are kids supported when they go to college? And, one thing that we try to stress is that, one, keep in mind, and this is kind of crazy, I have an 18-year-old. Once a child becomes 18, they are their own parent. And I can tell you, I don't know how my son could actually be his own parent, but legally, he is his own educational parent. But that prepares them for what they have to do when they go into college. Because when they go into college, they can't call mom and dad and say, hey, this professor's not giving me some extra time on an exam. It is up to the student to take what documentation they have to whatever department it is at NC State or Chapel Hill or Appalachian or Wilmington. What I recommend is that when a student has a 504 plan, make sure it's updated by the time they leave their high school. And then they have a copy of that plan in paper and they can take it to that university, and that university can see what they can do to provide that equal support. I will tell you, universities may not provide all that support they got in high school, but at least they have that documentation to show them, yes, when this student was in high school, they got extra time. They had guided notes or whatnot. So make sure for those that have those juniors and seniors that their 504 plans are getting updated so they can take it with them to college. There is talk about the federal government updating what we call regulations, and the rumor is that they're going to put a lot more emphasis into post-secondary. We haven't seen it yet, but we hope it's on its way because I think those kids just need as much support as they need in college. It's not for a kid to have all these supports in high school, and then once they get to college, it all drops away because that child still has that diagnosis, right? ADHD, asthma, anxiety, diabetes. So we want to make sure those kids are still protected. Also, what falls under 504 is what we call homebound. Okay, and this one is for very serious concerns. This is the most restrictive setting under an IEP or a 504. Um, these are students that cannot attend school physically for at least 4 weeks. These are very significant cases. We do require medical documentation. This is where it is a little different from regular 504. Um, we can't just put a child on homebound to stay at home unless we have appropriate documentation from a medical provider to say, yeah, this child cannot come to school. Um, it is a very significant placement with, some kids absolutely need it. Some kids have a physical or mental condition that does not allow them to come to school. You know, maybe they have cancer or they're in the hospital. Maybe some have such extreme social anxiety that they cannot come to school. And for those kids, that's what's best for them. But it is very restrictive and they don't get the same experience. Think about that. Think about when you were back in high school. Can you imagine going through high school without being in the classroom? That your instruction is through a homebound teacher um, on teams 2, 3, maybe 4 hours a week. So we do have a handful of students that are on homebound, and for some kids, they absolutely need it. Um, but it does fall under Section 504 or IEP, and so I did want to spend a little bit of time going over that placement with you guys. And here again to reiterate the impacts that homebound has, and again, sometimes absolutely necessary for our students. We still need to try to provide free and appropriate education. But academically, they're typically only getting 1 to 4 hours of direct instruction. It can impact their motivation. Um, we don't want to get them off course for graduation. You know, what we try to do first, maybe a student can go partial day or have a decreased course load. Maybe they take 3 courses instead of 4. Um, we also want to think about the social emotional impact homebound has. Removal from the school environment. Um, it limits their their impact with adults and experiences, relationships. So their peers, like it is absolutely a necessity for some kids. But again, I can't stress enough how impactful it can be to our kids. S- So we are kind of wrapping things up here, and where does this all land? And it comes down to what we call child find, and this is an educational mandate. And what it says is that Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act includes a child find mandate. And what it says is that the child find requires all students to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities, regardless of the severity of their disabilities. So whether it is stage 3 cancer, asthma, sickle cell, diabetes, it is up to us if we have suspicion of a disability, we have to at least evaluate for it. And I really like the second bullet is the needs of the whole child should be considered, not just academic. Too much we look at just learning. Okay. Um, 504 I think about has 3 main prongs. Academics is absolutely one, but what's equally impactful can behavior and health. And so those 3 things is where we consider under child find. And we're going to start wrapping things up that, you will have my contact information. If you would like to reach out to your school about inquiring more about 504, typically we say go to your school counselor. Now, your school counselor may not be the one that does the 504 process, but at least they can point you in the right direction. So Section 504 does has its own department. We're very pleased you got to see our wonderful team. We do have our own helpline. It's 980-343-0001. We do try to operate those phones between 7:30 and 4:30, and you can leave a message and we will get back to you. So with that, and you could see how I flubbed around with the technology with that video at the beginning. I'm going to do my best to look at the Q&A and see if there's some questions I can answer. I did intentionally um, leave a good 20 minutes to answer questions because I know there's a lot of questions out there about what Section 504 is and how it's going to help. I'm looking at there, we got over almost 150 people in here, so I'm going to do my best to try to answer some of these questions for everybody. So I'm going to start at the top, guys, and I really appreciate you staying with me. If you'd like to stay on and hear some of these questions. Is there a difference in effect or impact of homebound versus a child that attends a virtual school? That is a phenomenal question. Absolutely. The virtual school is a magnet program. It is its own program. And for that, it doesn't require like a medical condition that restricts a kid from attending school. Um, Virtual school is its own school. It is like attending a Myers Park or an AK or a Harding, but the instruction is virtual. Versus a homebound is not as intense. Like like we talked about, it may be 1 to 4 um, hours a week. So even after having a 504 plan established with a teacher team and they sign off it, I find that some forget or still not follow it being in, I'm sorry, let me read the whole thing. Forget to or still do not follow it being inflexible to the accommodation. How should this be addressed as a frustrated parent, even with being right? That's an excellent, excellent question. So if you still feel like a plan is not being implemented as is agreed upon, my recommendation is going to school administration. Um, I always believe in the chain of command. Like you first address it with the teacher. If the teacher's not doing it, then you address it with the 504 case manager, who was the one facilitating the meeting. And if you're still not getting it, then you would contact the administrator. Again, I work my way up, principal. And if you're still not getting anywhere, you have my contact information. Does a child with a 504 plan always stay in general ed classes? Really good question. Yeah. So, yes, because 504 is general education, it's not that specially designed instruction like it is with an IEP. So they do generally stay in general education. What is the time frame for completing a 504? First day of requested, and how long do we find out until it's granted? Man, you guys are on top of things. Um, so, great question. Under IEPs, there's that 90-day timeline. Well, the federal government just says within reasonable amount of time under Section 504 law. But what I will tell you is most case law supports less than 90 days because in most cases, a 504 evaluation is less intense than an IEP. If you see that it is taking 2, 3 months, that's not okay. I mean, 2 months may be acceptable depending on the time of the year, but if we're going on 3 months, that's time to reach out to that school. And if you're still not getting anywhere, you're welcome to contact us. Would it be better for a child to transition to a 504 than an IEP if she is most likely need an IEP through high school? Is it hard to switch to an IEP to a 504? That is a great question. Um, when I do training, I tell the people I can answer almost every question with 2 words. It depends. Um, it can be hard to go from an IEP to a 504, but I will say there's something called LRE, which is what we call the least restrictive environment. And we do want to provide students with the right amount of support. Now, people may not agree with me all the time on this one, but I do say that it can be just as harmful over accommodating, over supporting than under supporting. Because if you're supporting a child more than what they need, then they are not learning to work with their accommodations, or I'm sorry, work with their disabilities through their accommodations. Um, we do think that you have to kind of balance it. It's so hard to answer that question without me reading what the specifics are. I would look at the data. If the kid is still not being successful with an IEP or they're just maintaining, then I would have a hard time saying, okay, let's drop down to a 504. But if a kid is being successful with an IEP and they are reaching all their goals, then I think a 504 is reasonable and least restrictive. Keep in mind, if you're at a 504, you go from an IEP to a 504, and in dropping down to that 504, and after receiving data after months or years, and that student is not being successful, that 504 team can always refer back to the IEP team to do an evaluation. Is this meeting available for review at a later date? And I'm not sure if I quite understand the whole part of it. What I can tell you is that 504 meetings should be reviewed every year. Federal law doesn't require annual reviews, but it's always been considered best practice. They can be reviewed multiple times a year if there is an impact. So let's say your child has a 504 meeting in October, okay? But that student come April or February is really struggling. That student may need another annual review. So it can be reviewed if you see substantial impacts. Can a child get speech and occupational therapy or behavior intervention plan or 504? You guys are great. What I can tell you with that is yes, occupational therapy, physical therapy, audiology support is considered what we call in the special ed world as a related service. Here's the trick. It's considered a related service under IEP, meaning it can't stand alone. That's not true in 504. In 504, you can get occupational therapy, physical therapy, audiology support by itself under 504. So yes, it can. Speech is a little bit harder to explain. In most cases, because speech language impairment is its own special education category, it's typically handled as an IEP if they need direct services. But we do have cases if a kid had a speech IEP but doesn't need direct services, but they only need accommodations, then they can get accommodations for speech impairments under 504. They would just exit an IEP and go to a 504. But direct speech services are handled our IEP. And a behavior intervention plan can absolutely be served under a 504. There's actually a question on a 504 plan where it asks, does the student need a behavior plan? It needs to be part of the 504 team to make sure what does the student need. Will these slides be available to access or download after the meeting concludes? Yes, they will. It's my understanding that there will be information on how to get that. What's the difference between IEP and 504? Is speech help available through 504? So it sounds like we're kind of hearing the same thing. Again, an IEP requires specially designed instruction that is required because of their disability, whereas 504 is mostly accommodations. And like we talked about, speech direct services is handled through an IEP. Can we convert an IEP to a 504 or an IEP to a 504? And I think we've kind of covered a lot of that. Yes, accommodations under an IEP can be handled through a 504, but again, it's that the direct instruction, specially designed instruction that can only be handled through an IEP. Do kids go from IEP to 504? Yes. Do kids go from 504 to IEPs? Yes. It's what we call least restricted environment. It's what the kid needs to access the learning environment. Is there an information session on IEPs? I do not know that, but I think that's an excellent idea that we can pass on to our parent academy. Will this slide deck be made available after the session? Yes, I believe we can. And then it says, please provide feedback for today's session. So it looks like there is the link to provide feedback. I'm going to go make sure I've covered all the questions here. So I will go over here and there's our feedback as well. So guys, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to learn more about Section 504. Last year we finished the school year with over 8,000 kids that are covered under Section 504. When I joined this department almost 10 years ago, we are a little over 4,000. So it has significantly grown. We took a little bit of a dip during the COVID years, and that's just because, like we talked about child find, we weren't in the school, so it was so much harder to child find our kids. But it has come back, especially with our cases of anxiety and depression have just really increased after our COVID years. And so we've really seen our 504 numbers increase. I can't thank you enough for taking them time this afternoon to spend with us. And you have my contact information. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
And Ben, if we are able to stay on, we did have some additional questions come through while you were answering the others at the top.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, oh, new post. I'll press that there. All righty. Let's see. Are 504 plans appropriate for highly intellectual kids performing academically or above grade level? I swear, some people have been doing some research on these because these are very high level questions. That's awesome. Absolutely. We hear the terms like twice exceptional, both ADHD and intellectually gifted. Absolutely. They can be provided accommodations just like any others. The law is very clear. Um, Again, we have to be cautious. We can't provide advantages, even for kids that are, highly intellectual. But they can absolutely be eligible. Whether they need a plan or not, that's up to the team. You mentioned that OT can be part of a 5-4 plan. Does that mean OT accommodations and not OT services? Great question. Yes, so you can get both. You can get OT accommodations. Maybe they need extra time for a writing assignment or whatnot. And direct OT services, occupational therapy services, can be provided under 504. I think we just discussed a little bit about differences between 504 and IEPs. It really comes down to specially designed instruction that's needed for a child because of their disability. I sometimes get the question, well, Ben, what is specially designed instruction? And that's really that's a really hard question to answer because it comes down to what instruction is needed for a child to make progress that only a child with a disability requires. It's provided by a special education teacher. It could be co-taught, or we call inclusion. Maybe that special education teacher goes in to that regular classroom because that's what the kid needs to get education. So that is again what specially designed instruction is. So there's that. I see new posts, so I'm going to keep moving up. All right. It asks, if I wanted my child to have homebound plan and is approved by doctor already, how do I go about CMS to approve it? Okay, great question. So we do have a homebound process. Um, it would be hard for me to go through the whole thing, but what my advice is that you go to your school counselor. Your school counselor does understand the homebound process. We have to get basically release of information from the um, the parent, and then we send the homebound recommendation form to the medical provider because it has very specific questions we need to answer. Then that document comes back to our office, we review it, and then give it back to the school to have a homebound consideration meeting. Okay. Would a student with a learning disability, reading comprehension, and diagnosis from private neurologists be eligible for IEP or 504? So remember what I said? I can answer almost any question with 2 words. It depends. Um, if you're receiving a diagnosis from a private medical provider, one thing that I always caution parents, and this is when I was in the schools as a school psychologist, is just because a child has a diagnosis from a medical provider, a private one that says a uh, reading disorder or a specific learning disorder in the areas of reading, that is a private diagnosis. It doesn't necessarily translate to what we would call a reading disability because the criteria is a little bit different. It's up to a team. So, what a team would do is they would take that diagnosis from the private neurologist, they would look at it, the team would consider, do we need to do additional information, different evaluations, different tests? Is there data to support an IEP? If there is data to support it, then a IEP would be written. However, and if you ever feel like you're getting pushback, if you don't get if the team does not recognize IEP, that team should automatically refer it back down to 504 for considerations of eligibility of accommodations. So if you receive that diagnosis, it should go to one team or the other. It just depends on the needs of the child. All right. Let's see. We got some more here. Um, I don't see contact information. Can you share it again? From what I believe, there is the slide deck, and my slide deck information is in that my contact information is in the slide deck. You're always welcome to, if all else fails, Google Ben Bender CMS, and my contact information comes up every time. It is kind of funny. It used to be right there, but since the Charlotte FC soccer team drafted a guy named Ben Bender, my name has fallen quite far down the list on Google. Can a kid get multiple accommodations under 504? Absolutely. It's what the kid needs. Does the kid need preferential seating and extra time? Does the student need preferential seating, extra time, and tested in a separate room? Do they need read aloud? You want to look at what the student needs. But again, you don't want to give a child too much because, again, we want to, especially once they start getting into the middle school, we want to have that student in there because who knows the student best but the student themselves? Okay. Is it too late in the year for a senior in high school to have a 504 evaluation? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You would reach out to your 504 contact, which is typically your school counselor. They can point you in the right direction. You can request a 504 evaluation, and the process can be started even as a senior. What is the messaging for an anxious middle schooler to minimize their feeling of being different? Okay, well that is a tough one, and it's a little outside what 504 is, but I'm going to kind of talk very briefly. I'm going to switch roles. I'm going to go from 504 program manager to a school psychologist. Middle school is really challenging, and I think as parents, I'm one too. And my child just got out of the middle school, and I can remember those days where um, the kids come home and they're just very anxious, um, feeling of being different. Um, my recommendation, without getting too much into the details, is um, I would make contact with your child's school counselor and have that ask time to sit down and explain your concerns. Um, I do think that a lot of times some type of counseling, a lot of schools have what we call school-based mental health. It allows kids to talk through their anxious behaviors. What I can say is, like, even though I've been a school psychologist for 20 years, um, my kids sometimes won't even talk to me, and I don't take it personally. I used to say, even as a special education teacher, I am the worst tutor for my kids. As parents, we have that different role, and our kids may not respond to us like we can. They're not going to relate to us as much as we love them. We may not be the best person for that. So I really encourage you to sit down with your school counselor, maybe psychologist, and be there to support your child. But I appreciate the advocacy you have for your kids. All right. I think, let's see. Oh, someone put in our contact information. Well done. Thank you. Greatest team ever. Thank you so much. All right. Let's see where we're going. All right. I posted this 12 minutes ago and left unanswered. What accommodations should be available for high school students with ADHD for they're unable to follow and understand verbal instructions in class? Okay, great question. Again, it depends on what the student needs. Sometimes we have, again, this is more geared towards elementary. Again, I am transparent. Some people call me too transparent sometimes. Is a lot of times in elementary, we'll have a check for understanding where teachers will circle back to the student, say, hey, do you understand this? Um, you look at, is it specific classes that your student is struggling in? Is it the content? Where is why? I mean, that's where I think it's really important to have the student in those 504 meetings and come up with a solution of why are they missing this content and what can we do to remediate that content so that students understand what the directions are, what's the assignment. I have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to keep moving on. My child was recently switched from a 504, to an IEP to a 504. He struggles a lot with learning new concepts, but the school is hesitant to test him for a learning disability. How can we convince them to get him tested? That's a great question, and there's no easy solution for that. Again, a parent can request an IEP meeting at any time. Doesn't necessarily say they're going to get one. They would ask, what is the data to support the request? To me, I always instruct parents is show them the data. Data is about as objective as we can get. Help me understand, since my child has switched to an IEP or 504 to a 504, my child has D's. He is failing classes. Help me understand why we think a 504 is enough for their child. And you just have to have the data kind of support your case. To what grade does a child qualify for Section 504 with a permanent disability? So I guess I would need a little more information on that one. It really just depends on the disability. Every 3 years, a 504 team will look at eligibility and does that disability substantially limit a major life activity? And in most cases, the disability does stay with them. A kid's always going to have diabetes for the most part, probably always going to have asthma or sickle cell. ADHD anxiety is a little less clear, but it's up to the team to determine if they qualify every 3 years. Again, there's our more feedback. What plan do you recommend for a child with significant reading disabilities already evaluated by CMS? Again, that's a hard one without looking at the data. I would, as a psychologist, I would be looking at where's the struggle with reading. Is it basic reading? Is it reading comprehension? Is it fluency, which is how quickly and fluid you look at your reading? So again, like I talked about, a parent can always request an IEP meeting if they need it. Sometimes, again, that is a shortcoming of a 5-4 is we don't provide direct instruction, specially designed instruction in like reading, writing, and math. So you kind of have to look at what the needs of the child are. Again, what's the difference between IEP and 504 plan? Again, it has to do with that specially designed instruction. All right. I'm going to keep moving here, guys. I can stay as long as you can. Let's see. Prior question for a child diagnosed with anxiety through a prior question is for a child diagnosed with anxiety through a private evaluation. And I apologize. When you say prior question, I've probably gone through about 50 questions, so it's challenging for me to address what your question is. Again, if a student's diagnosed with anxiety through a private evaluation, it may go the route of an IEP or a 504. It just depends on the need of the child. If I'm not quite answering your question, you're welcome to contact me directly so I can get more information about that. Okay. All right. I think I have answered all the questions. Is that correct, my colleagues there?
I believe that you have answered the majority of them. And then families, thank you for understanding. If there's any questions that were not answered and your school cannot answer, I'm going to repost the help desk line for you to reach out directly and make sure that those questions are able to be answered for you. We appreciate your engagement. And Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of these questions today.
Thank you so much, guys.